You are listening to Designing the 21st Century. The design world has recently lost one of its most important and brilliant legends. Gaetano Pesce died last month at 84, leaving an enormous legacy behind. During his 6-decade career, he held a special position in contemporary art and design, always remaining provocative, surprising, and interesting. He was an architect by training, but devoted his life and career to design, creating innovative furniture and objects that were at time eccentric, at time radical, and always colorful. They may appear to be playful or whimsical at first, but if you know how to read them, you'll find that they are filled with social, political, and contemporary narratives. Gaetano believed that design should be utilized as a means to express ideas and stories. He belonged to a generation of Italian radicals who sought to move design from its conventional, functional role into a means of storytelling. Perhaps his most celebrated piece of furniture is Donna, an armchair shaped like a female body attached to a sphere by a wire. It is a feminist statement portraying women as prisoners in the 60s society at the height of the women's rights movement. Marc, what made Gaetano important in the context, in the story of design?
That is too easy a question for Gaetano. Nothing was easy with Gaetano in that he was an architect who started out as a conceptual artist in many ways. He was a designer who considered himself an architect, but who also wanted to consider himself a designer. He came up with ways to bring expression into design that we take for granted today, but that largely can trace back to his early work. In many ways, the contributions that he brought were too vast to bring it down to very simple taglines. But if you consider his importance today, it is just how much we think that what he has achieved is common sense now, when it was not common sense at the time.
Sara, you worked for him for 3 years?
I did.
Where did you meet him?
Unexpectedly, I met him at the restaurant that he loved going, his favorite restaurant in the Upper East Side. At the time, I was working at Italian Cultural Institute, but to make extra money, I was working as a hostess at the restaurant, and he was a frequent customer. The first time I met him, it was because the owner of the restaurant introduced us, and little it mattered that I studied communication and I was a passionate of art and design, and I was working at the Italian Cultural Institute that had a show of him at the time. He didn't even care about that. He just cared about the way he and I interacted for those 3 minutes. He asked me for the number and he said, tomorrow you're going to get a call from my assistant and come for an interview in my office. Gaetano was a person strongly driven by instinct. And he just felt the persons that he was interacting with by that rather than resumes.
Marc, when you went out with him for dinner, we are all talking about the same restaurant, by the way. What was it like? I tell you about myself. I remember he's walking into this restaurant. I think he ate there every single night when he was in New York. And the owner is Italian. And he just brought him whatever he liked. He didn't have to order.
In a way, it felt like being invited to his home, and there were just his family there. I remember at times he ordered for me, and at other times he said, "Why don't you order? I see what I like." He usually in later years he very often ate the minestrone, the soup, but what was it like? It was always fun. And there was no way to prepare for it. It was always unexpected what would be the outcome of the dinner.
And always new things, new projects, right?
Yes.
I found this amazing about him.
Yes.
When you worked for him at the office, I was at this office in Soho, and it's very colorful and it's very full with so many things. But then I asked him once, how do you live? Have you been to his house, to his apartment?
No, but I FaceTimed with him during the pandemic when he was in his home.
He told me I live with nothing. I said, no color? He said, no color, no furniture. But you've been to his house in Brazil.
I did, yeah.
So how was it? What is it?
The house in Brazil was part of his, was one of his creations. So it was colorful and it was figurative. It was a figurative architectural experiment. So the windows had a profile of a face. There was a portrait on the floors made of resin, and the facade was made of tiles. Each of them made in Brooklyn, in his workshop in Brooklyn. So the house in Brazil was one of his creation, which goes along with what you saw in the office, which is what I was surrounded by when I was working with him. But Gaetano was starting from a point of blank slate and rigor for his creations that looked exactly the opposite as the bracelet I'm wearing and the one you're wearing. Very free shapes, almost aleatory process of manufacturing, etc., etc. What you saw in the creations, it was a result of method and rigor of his type of thinking. So it doesn't surprise me that he was living with nothing and very white colors at home.
You know, Marc, that one of his innovations was that he used resin in a way to create one-off. So in other words, let's say he had a mold of a chair, but he would pour different colors of resin, so it made it one-off. And that was innovative. And that's very much, I think, preceding contemporary design today. And you, as a dealer of contemporary design, how do you see his vision being alive today?
I think half of what is being made today in contemporary design, and half is not a firm 50%. It's just it's a feeling. It has a huge debt to him in that sense. It's this idea that you use industrial materials, but you make something that is unique and supposedly noble that you're addressing. That is very much at the core of today's contemporary design's DNA. The idea that subversion is part of a design process. There are not many others of his generation who brought that into the field, who rebelled against the rationalism and who rebelled against just against the patriarchy that was existing in the way that he did.
And what is your take on his material, on resin?
Similar. It's in a way subversive. It's an industrial material. It's not a noble material. But then to create things that evoke singular emotions, that's how I identify a work by him.
Sara, did he craft the furniture in resin by himself, in his hands?
Yes, he did.
Where?
And he had a team as well. So I would say when I was working with him, he was at the workshop and working with his hands for the most crucial moments of the making of a piece or the details. So the most personal touches were by him. But he had a team that he trained pretty well, and they were given the space to play and be wrong. If anything, they were remaking a piece altogether. So he was training others to do the same as well.
So what was his day like?
His day, again, surprisingly to most people, he was very systematic in the way he was working and very structured in his the organization of his time. So he was always starting from home, waking up relatively early and drawing by himself at home. Sometimes he was giving the office a call to coordinate things. Sometimes he was just very much immersed in his inspiration and was just drawing. Then he was coming to the office every day when he wasn't traveling, every day at 2. Very punctual. He was a person that was always on time, actually. And he was most likely showing up with the drawings from the day or from the morning. Sometimes the drawing were... Most times they were on paper, brown paper specifically, and then others just on cloths or pieces of materials that he, for instance, found interesting from the night at the restaurant before. So he was showing up with the drawings and talking about the drawings with the team at the workshop to create something out of it. Otherwise, he was sitting on the sofa in the beautiful Tramonto, New York, the sunset in New York sofa that we had in the show in the office, and he was just going through the correspondence with us at the office. We were 3 at a time. So
he had a busy practice.
Very busy practice. After that, some days he was going to the workshop, in Brooklyn, maybe at around 5. And then sometimes he was ending the day there by himself after the team left. Other times he was taking a taxi and go directly to the restaurant.
To the restaurant, of course, to eat Italian food. Marc, you are an expert on Italian radical design of the 60s and 70s. You know it really, really well. How do you place Gaetano Pesce in the context of that radical movement? He was different. He was
mostly outside
right?
of it, I was going to say. The interesting thing is that none of them really saw themselves as a coherent group. This is not a movement in the sense of movements in art history where there's a leader or two and where there's sort of an idea of rules or a framework. These are a lot of individuals who each contributed into a field that was growing in every which direction. He's not really part of it. At
also
that time.
Socially?
No.
Really?
No, not really. He was aware of it.
Yeah.
And they were aware of each other. But I don't place him per se as part of what we call today radical design, except there's no better explanation for what he did at the time. But he was, again, this is contradictions, right? He was on one hand working closely with industry and doing some of the most iconic pieces of the time that were really forward-looking, the Up series, for example. He was working with industry in coming up with new ways of making within industrial materials, like with Braccio di Ferro, the Moloch lamp, the Golgotha series, etc. That went nowhere, but commercially, but artistically yielded some of the most important pieces of design history. And at the same time, he was not really working like a Sotzes or like anyone you want to place in radical Italian design.
He's was one of a kind.
Completely.
And I want to tell you what I think is the most memorable, my favorite pieces of his are the water tables. Do you remember the water tables that he did for David Gill? They are just like each one of them, I think there were 6 of them, and he invited me to the workshop in Brooklyn to see them before they left for London. And each one of them represents a different situation of water in the world with like little details on it. Do you remember, were you there when he did that?
Yes, I started just when he was realizing these tables. And I went to the opening in London when he was presenting them. He was very passionate about that collection, as for all the collections, I have to say. But in there, he experimented representing water, for what I know, for the first time. And he put some of his personal history, as he was doing for other situations too. But I think he had a special relationship with the Laguna table, because he spoke about Venice. Of course, he was inspired by Venice. So that table, yes, meant a lot for him. And I remember when he was working exactly on the brugolas and other parts of it. So after I went to Venice for the first time with him to work with Venini, later that year, I was touched to see how close the resemblance of the actual Laguna in Venice was. Yes.
Wow. Marc, what is your favorite piece? Do you have one?
You know what my personal favorite is? I have a mama chair in my kitchen, and all my children have. This has gone through serious stress testing, and it's still the centerpiece of our family. That's my personal favorite for a personal reason. I don't have a favorite because I think I would have to list about 20, 30, 40 pieces by him to really sum it up. But what just struck me is the tables address a topic which is water, which makes no sense to address materially by something solid, as solid as it is in a way. He addresses very essential topics, before you talked about a chair being addressing feminism and the feminist movement. We're talking about a table that addresses Golgotha, which has to do with the Passion of Christ. These are very essential topics that he was sensitive to.
He was sensual.
Yes.
But he was also people's person. In what way?
In the way that the human aspect was everything for him. He was somebody that could appreciate a person by looking at them, how they were moving in a space like this, for instance. He liked simple things, simple people, simple food, simple messages and concepts. And I think in his work is also very clear.
But he was complex, right?
Yes.
In what way?
I think if I can digress, any artist, if it's a musician, if it's a fashion designer, if it's a painter, if it's a designer, if you're addressing simple topics, you cannot be simple. You in order to address such fundamental core human aspects, you don't transform that into 3-dimension by a simple process. How was he complex? I can't think of any way that he was not.
Wow. That's what I feel.
Yeah.
Exactly the same way. So how do you think, let's say 100 years from now, how do you think he'll be remembered?
Well, let me start by saying I think he's one of from any period 100 years later, not that many people are remembered, and I believe he will be remembered. 100 years is a long period. From that time, I think if you look back, you'll see the New Domestic Landscape. You'll see probably the Up series. And then you'll see his contribution to this whole idea that became the idea that creators can be designers and architects and make with their own hands.
Sara, how do you think he would like to be remembered?
As one of the people who started thinking of art and design with a huge intersection.
Yes. What a special occasion for the three of us to remember Gaetano Pesce, the man that we knew so well, and I can't believe that he's gone. Marc, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Sara, thank you.
Absolutely.
It was very special. This is Daniela Ohad. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Designing the 21st Century.